Hi, I'm Ken Wu with the Endangered Ecosystems Alliance. I just wanted to give a quick update on the current policy situation on old growth forests in British Columbia. As many people know, we have a new Premier in BC, Premier David Eby, and he promised that within his first 100 days, he would expedite implementation of the Old Growth Strategic Review Panel's recommendations. So what has he done? Okay, first, it's important to recognize that the vast majority of old growth forests in British Columbia are on the unceded territories of First Nations. That means that First Nations consent and support is vital if there's going to be any protection of old growth forests. And I believe that the right path to get there is also First Nations consent for deferrals as well, which is a precursor for developing the trust for establishing legislated protected areas. First Nations across the province have an economic dependency in many communities on old growth timber revenues and jobs in the form of revenue sharing agreements, tenures, joint ventures, employment agreements, so forth. So the only viable path to establish protected areas is if First Nations have the freedom to choose the protection path if there is the funding to enable an alternative economy in tourism, clean energy, sustainable seafood, non-timber forest products, and so forth, instead of logging the last old growth forest and getting revenues from that logging and jobs. So, what has Eby done? Eby has committed to doubling the protected areas in BC from 15% now to 30% by 2030 to develop a conservation financing mechanism that is economic development funding for First Nations, linked to new Indigenous protected and conserved areas, and to target protection for the most biodiverse areas. This is a big change. Previously, there was no commitment by the BC government to expand protected areas, to undertake conservation financing, to even recognize Indigenous protected and conserved areas, and to target the most biodiverse areas, which would include productive old growth forests and the areas usually left out or minimized from the protected area system. There's also a coming BC nature agreement with federal and provincial funding. That would be the immediate closer term funding that's needed to help power through an expansion of protected areas. And in the longer run, of course, there has to be a consistent funding source as land use planning, which takes years to do, of community consultation, of mapping, in terms of engaging stakeholders by the First Nations before most protected areas can be established. So the pieces are coming together. And on top of that, the BC government has indicated that they're going to be developing a biodiversity declaration that will put ecological integrity and biodiversity and ecosystems first in any resource and land use decisions. Now, if that actually has teeth and is done in a way that actually protects biodiversity, makes protected areas central, ensures the standards and integrity of protected areas, has ecosystem-based targets, and prioritizes the most endangered ecosystems, then that would be a historically unprecedented move forward in conservation that has not been seen in Canadian history or North American history, and I can't think of anywhere else on the planet, if that happens. So, the BC government is moving in the right direction, finally, and Eby should be thanked. We're not there yet, but it's going to take many years while land use planning is undertaken by First Nations to really expand the protected areas system. In the meantime, the deferrals have to come through, and the way that comes through is through funding from the government for First Nations. The immediate thing is significant funding for First Nations economic development linked to new protected areas and deferrals to ensure that the biodiversity declaration has teeth, has ecosystem-based targets, makes protected areas central, and also there has to be support for communities, forestry-dependent communities, so that we can develop a value-added, smart, second growth forest industry based on engineered wood products and value-added. So there's a path. I've been doing this for over 3 decades now, non-stop, working to save old growth forests in British Columbia, and this is actually a sea change. There's a lot of forces trying to hold it back. There's a lot of old thinking pervading the bureaucracy and the BC government. There's also some major forward thinking as well, and environmental thinking, and that goes quite high up. I think the Premier is starting to move in the right direction. We'll see where this goes. We got to keep pushing, but understanding what is needed. Ecosystem-based targets, and support for First Nations. So let's work hard and make sure this protection happens.